Hello guys and welcome to my Arcane Mage Mythic Plus guide. After you've watched this guide, you should be able to do things like this.
Interrupt.
I'm first going to talk about legendaries, covenants, stats, trinkets, soulbinds, and talents. As an Arcane Mage in Mythic Plus, you'll want to be Kyrian. The other three covenants are not viable. You want to play with Arcane Harmony as your first legendary, and your covenant legendary that you'll gain with Unity is Harmonic Echo. For stats, you want to prioritize intellect, which is item level, over crit and mastery, over haste and versa. This means that you want to have about the same amount of crit mastery and the same amount of haste and versa. I'd recommend going with a minimum of 10% versa and haste, and the rest in mastery and crit. For trinkets, you want one unused trinket, so either Ruby or Inscrutable Quantum Device, and one passive trinket, so either Solia or Changeling. You want to use Solia for whatever stat you're lacking, not especially for crit or mastery. So if you have enough crit and mastery, and let's say you have 13% haste but 5% versa, you should definitely try to get the versa with Solia just to balance out your stats. For the Changeling, I'd recommend making it a crit or a mastery proc, but also the crit slash mastery slash haste proc can be very good for you. I personally prefer Ruby over Quantum Device, but if you prefer to play Quantum Device, you should try to get crit from it. You can also alternatively play two unused trinkets, which means Ruby and IQD, and alternate between each one of them in each one of your CDs. So you can use IQD on your first Arcane Power, Ruby on your second Arcane Power, IQD on your third, etc. For Soulbinds, you always want to play Pelagos, since it gives you mastery when you use Radiant Spark, and New Farm Resolve is also a pretty powerful buff. Let's get into talents. In the first row, you want to play Amplification. This talent synergizes greatly with the Conduit we're going to talk about later, so you have to pick it for your rotation. On the second row, you can play either Shimmer or Slipstream. I personally always play Shimmer, because I really enjoy not having Blink on the global cooldown. Shimmer is also usable while you cast, so you can Shimmer while casting Mount, for example, or any other spell. As Arcane, we have pretty low haste, and every global matters a lot. So losing one global only to be able to move while consuming a clear casting proc does not seem worth to me. However, I know Cinnamon, who only plays Slipstream, which is currently the first Arcane Mage world, so really both options are viable. On the third row, pick Rune of Power. It's a primordial spell in your rotation, so you can't skip on having this spell. On the fourth row, pick Resonance. This makes your barrage hit 15% harder for every target it hits. This is the talent that makes Arcane Mage a funnel class. On the fifth row, you can pick either one of the three talents. I personally prefer Chrono Shift, since it doesn't require me to cast an extra spell to gain a benefit from this talent row, as the speed bonus and the slow is directly implemented in your Arcane Barrage, which you press pretty often, making Arcane Mage a very mobile spec. But I think the other two talents are viable as well, even in the highest level of keys. On the second to last row, you want to play Arcane Orb. Again, this is a pretty important talent to pick, nothing really to say here, you need the spell. And same for last row, you want to play Empowered. This is not a debate, you have to pick this talent. Let's talk about the Arcane Mage rotation. Arcane Mage relies heavily on not failing your rotation during CDs, so this is very important. First of all, before using your rotation, you want to build 18 stacks from your legendary before using your CDs, which is Arcane Harmony. Our big CDs have 1 minute 30 seconds cooldown, and our small CDs have 45-second cooldown. The rotation is identical for both, except for the fact that you either use Arcane Power for the big CDs or Rune of Power for the small CDs. Here is how the big CD rotation looks like. You want to start with Kyrian Spark into Touch of the Magi, Arcane Power, 4 Arcane Blasts, and 1 Arcane Barrage. And here's how the small rotation CD looks like. Rune of Power, Kyrian Spark, Touch of the Magi, 4 Arcane Blasts, 1 Arcane Barrage. This is a single target rotation. There are 2 AoE rotations that I use. The first one looks like this. Kyrian Spark, Touch of the Magi, Arcane Power, 2 Arcane Explosions, Barrage, Arcane Orb, Barrage. For 45-second CDs, it's the same rotation, but opening with Rune of Power before Kirin Spark instead of Arcane Power after Touch of the Magi. The second AoE rotation is as follows: 4 Arcane Explosions into Barrage. I use the first rotation in single target, or where there is a big mob to funnel and we got no rogue in the group. Timing a key is a team effort, and we all have to play a part in it. Even if we lose a bit of damage by using our single target rotation in AoE to funnel a big mob, it's still worth it because the key goes on faster. The Shallcast shards in halls is a very good example of this. The second rotation I use when there are 48 targets. The last one I only use when there are a lot of small adds and no specific add I want to funnel. The perfect example is the pool with many small blobs in Plaguefall. For Conduits, you want to play the Eye of the Ascended to increase Kirin Spark damage increase, Arcane Prodigy to be able to line up Arcane Power with every second touch of the Magi, which becomes our 1 minute and 30 second CD. This is also the Conduit that synergizes greatly with Amplification, your first talent, and Magi's Brand for extra touch of the Magi damage accumulation. You can play whatever defensive and finesse conduits you want. The only two conduits that I'd really recommend are Diverted Energy, that makes your shields heal you for the damage they absorb, and Incantation of Swiftness for the extra speed on Invis. This conduit setup right here is the only one I play in all of my keys as Arcane. Let's talk about weak auras. The first one is the cast bar for your Arcane Missiles. It's really nice to see exactly what amount of stacks you get. Sometimes you can also launch an extra missile. Try to reuse the Arcane Missiles right before a missile launches, and the missile will still launch. You gain time with doing this since you build your stacks faster. Next, I use this weak aura to track my Arcane Harmony stacks. Then, I use this weak aura to track the Radiant Spark debuff on my target. This is amazing and shows you where you are in your rotation and how long you got till the debuff falls off. I use a weak aura to track my clear casting procs, since you can stack up to 3 and with a basic Blizzard proc you can only see if you have a proc, not the amount of procs, and you can see the duration. I use this weak aura to track Newfound's Resolve proc from Pelagos. I use this weak aura for Rune of Power. It doesn't reset the duration though, so if you use our Rune of Power, then Arcane Power, the weak aura won't work on the new Rune of Power that was automatically cast with Arcane Power. I use this crit proc weak aura to see if my Barrage critted. It's just a fun weak aura, it's not necessary, but I'll still link it. And I use a Ruby weak aura to see when my crit buff starts, since the Ruby buff doesn't start when you press it, and it has trial time. I will link all of these weak auras down below, so don't worry, you can have them all. Let's get into some a bit more pro Mythic Plus tips. First of all, we are aggro machines. Always try to use mirror images before using your CDs, especially your big CDs, which is Arcane Power, since you don't aggro when they're up. So you use mirror images before the pull or at the beginning of the pull, and then you use your CDs. Alternatively, you can be ready to press Invis to instantly lose aggro if you don't have mirror images. If that's the case, I don't recommend doing the AoE rotation, because you sometimes won't have time to Invis fast enough before dying from a melee hit if you get aggro. Because our AoE rotation requires us to be in melee with the targets, and our globals are not fast enough for us to Invis right when we get the aggro, if we do on pull. Also be aware to not use Invis if you need it for an Invis skip right after. Try to use sometimes greater invisibility as a wall, because it gives you 60% damage reduction, so you can for example only take one orb on the third boss of Sanguine Depths, and still live with Invis. Or 2 in the higher key levels, let's say. Combined with the speed conduit for invisibility, it becomes a really great utility ability, because you lose aggro, it's a shield, you gain some speed, so try to use it. It also has a really short cooldown compared to the other mage specs. Outside of CDs, don't stress too much about what you do. You just try to build stacks and consume them. You can generally do one orb in between CDs if you're in AoE situations, because orb has a 20-second cooldown and your CDs are 45-second long and you need orb for your CDs, either the big one or the small ones. And yeah, if there are a lot of mob, just basically spam Arcane Explosion and use your barrage on the biggest target, or do some Arcane Missiles to build some stacks on a specific target if you have to not be in melee. Don't stress too much about it. The rotation is really important during CDs, and out of CDs, just always press something. I am using this macro, which is a very simple macro. I only press it, and it says in my group, chain now, I blast. I use this for when we can chain a pack. Why? Because using Ruby on a low health target gives you more crit. So for extra damage, you can try to use Ruby right before a mob dies, and the travel time of the Ruby is long enough for the team to pull the next pack. You can engage with very big numbers by doing that, as you gain a lot of crit from it. This is an example of this from one of my high Mythic Plus runs, A23 Mists. As you can see, my Ruby is coming up. We know where the maze is open next, so I'm pressing my macro to tell them to chain pretty fast. I use my Ruby right before the mob dies, so I gain as much crit from it as I can. And you can see on the bottom left my stats, so you can see how much crit I gain from it. And even though I did the single target rotation here, I should have done the AoE rotation, I still open with a huge amount of DPS because my brush critted and it did a lot of damage because I had so much crit stat from the Ruby that I used this way. And basically that's it. Don't forget that Arcane Mage might blast, but we still are a support spec compared to Hunters and Warlocks. So don't hesitate to use your CDs in smaller pools for utility basically. For example, when the big DPS specs don't have theirs, like in Necromancers, in Necrotic Wake, or to funnel mid HP adds for certain dangerous add to die first, like an Inspired mob for example, Arcane Mage is great for that. Thank you for watching, and tell me in the comments below if you'd like to see me do commentaries on the next video of the Mythic Plus runs that I'll post.